Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. The focus of this video is going to be on the Kite Runner, published in 2003, for students who are studying the Political and Social Protest Writing module for AQA Literature Spec B. The Kite Runner also features on the AQA Language and Literature specification as well for recreational writing. So you might find this video useful if you're doing that as well, because you have to write a commentary about your piece of writing for that. So you might find it useful. The purpose of this video is to give students a selection of what I deem to be quite significant revision points for the novel in order to understand it and in order to interpret it. They are points that I find myself going through a lot in class across numerous different essay questions. So hopefully you will find this useful. So we're going to be creating a spider diagram in this video in which all of these points appear. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about with this novel is the relevance of this novel. So some of you might know that the Taliban were in control in Afghanistan from 1996 until 2001, when America and her allies invaded after 9/11. And America and her allies were in Afghanistan until 2021, so it was a 20-year mission. Lots and lots of money spent and lots of men and women killed because of it. And unfortunately, when America and her allies withdrew in 2021, I think it was August in the summer, the Taliban regained control very, very quickly. And it was all a bit bittersweet because people then started to question, well, what was all of that for? What were those 20 years for? Clearly, it was a failed mission if the Taliban came into power so quickly in a number of days. And the Taliban have now, since then, have created a number of restrictive rules, for example, banning women from particular educational establishments and so on and so forth. So political and social protest texts are very real. They're based on real events. They have lots of social realism in them. And the book sales of these texts will often fluctuate based on what's happening in the wider world. So in a world where everyone is conscious about what is happening in Afghanistan again, people are going to buy the Kite Runner. They're going to buy the Kite Runner because it's going to help them understand Afghanistan and understand Afghanistan's history. We don't just study, formal textbooks from history to understand the past. We also read literary texts as well, which are based on real events. So I believe, that the sales of this novel have gone up in the last 2 years as people turn to that novel to understand what's going on in the Middle East. So that gives you the idea of relevance. The reason why this book has relevance is because it helps us understand what's going on in the world, in a wider world, in the macrocosm. So the text therefore has value. What Hassan wanted to do as an Afghan man who sought political asylum in America when he was younger was he wanted to humanize a region. We're very used to seeing Afghanistan as a war-torn place on the news, but that's only one version of Afghanistan, is what Hassan is saying. Afghanistan also has beauty, it also has traditions, it also has a much more, perhaps, less violent past. So he wanted us to understand that as well, rather than see Afghanistan as just this stereotypical, constant kind of war zone. So the novel has relevance. One of the things that we learn in chapter 2 of the novel is that the textbooks are not being read fully when Amir goes to school. So as Amir is clearly a literate child, he does a lot of reading himself, and he finds that in the textbooks that the teachers at the school are not teaching him or his classmates about Hazara history. And that goes to show how the education system as an institution is complicit in the censoring of the past, because it does not correspond to the history which the Pashtun elite perhaps want the children to learn. Obviously, knowledge is power, and if you ration knowledge, or you censor knowledge, you prevent people from learning the real picture. You give them a version, and that clearly coincides with this kind of Pashtun Hazara binary, and this idea of the elite being in charge of what students learn. And if you're going to, in effect, cut out things from an education system or a syllabus, that's very close to radicalization. So it's almost perpetually, creating this tradition of the Hazaras being excluded from Afghanistan's history because they are seen as inferior. The kite is clearly a central symbol or motif in this novel. It's in our title, so we know that it's symbolic. The first thing I ask students is, who is the Kite Runner? So we have the definite article, the, meaning one. Who is that? And I think it's Hassan. So I think we have a novel here which is named after Hassan, not Amir. So that's my belief. Obviously, Hassan is the one that runs after the kite, enabling Amir to look victorious because Amir isn't as athletic or quick on his feet as Hassan. But also the kite is symbolic of a number of things. In the early chapters, it can be symbolic of childhood. It can be symbolic of that kind of almost utopian, idealized kite fighting tournament that happens in the winter when the schools aren't running. It can be representative of Amir's victory in chapter 7, having won that kite tournament. It can be symbolic of Hassan's kind of ability to act with loyalty, to actually go and run after the kite for Amir. But obviously the kite then also has more kind of serious connotations to do with Hassan's unrequited loyalty, of sacrifice, because clearly that's what Assaf wants in chapter 7, and because Hassan won't give the kite back, that's why Hassan has to suffer his rape, because it's how Assaf punishes Hassan in that chapter. The kite can also show the corruption of innocence. It can also show unreturned or unrequited loyalty, and just this difference between the two boys. So the kite starts off by being something pure and childlike, but then turns into something which is much more cruel and punishing in chapter 7, for example. It's worth noting as well, of course, that the kite comes back at the end, a generation later, when Sorab and Amir are flying kites in America. So there's something cyclical about that. The novel also has few female characters. 3 of them which are named are Soraya, Jamila and Sanyabar, but you also have other characters, other female characters that don't have a name as well. So you have Soraya, for example, who is Amir's wife, who runs away when she's 18 with a man from Virginia, and she suffers the punishment of that. Her father, General Tahiri, cuts all her hair off, for example, whereas the guy kind of seems to get away with it. Jamila has been told by General Tahiri that she cannot sing in public, so she's oppressed as well. She apparently has this beautiful singing voice, but she's not allowed to sing. And Sanyabar, Hassan's mother, comes back seeking redemption, or at least we're told she does later in the novel, but she comes back with a terrible gash to her face because she's been assaulted with some kind of knife the whole length of her face. So she's also punished as well. And you've also got the woman in the truck, the refugee in the truck, that Baba protects because the Russian soldier wants to rape her in the truck, and she is nameless. So women in this novel clearly suffer oppression, and at some points as well exploitation. The double standards, for example, of Afghan society, perhaps. So that's a question that's already come up for AQA, is about the significance of gender. And there might be other women in the novel as well who suffer because of their gender or their sex. Baba and Amir, ironically, are equally flawed. We think, for example, in the beginning that Baba is just this terrible, neglectful father figure. However, as we know, Baba is Hassan's father, and illegitimately. by, in effect, fathering Hassan behind Ali's back with Ali's wife Sanyabar. So both Baba has let down and betrayed Ali, who allegedly he grew up with all his life. Conversely, Amir has clearly let down Hassan, not necessarily through not doing anything at the rape in chapter 7, but because he then framed Hassan, I think in chapter 9, because he couldn't bear the guilt that he was reminded of every time he saw Hassan. So there's something, again, cyclical or cross-generational here. Both father and son, have let down and betrayed their closest friends. So there's something about the failure of the Pashtun elite here, perhaps, that just because you are regarded as more wealthy or powerful or legitimate in society does not mean that you aren't flawed, because we have two flawed characters there, one of which, of course, is our narrator. We need to be calling the Taliban some kind of totalitarian theocracy. Totalitarian meaning it's very, authoritarian. It's the theocracy because they are using allegedly biblical teaching of the Quran and Islam to justify their nationalistic extremist agenda. In other words, they feel that they have the right to do this because the God says they can. And of course, that's not what God says. But because they're using the Quran and Sharia law to create this very dystopian existence in the society of Afghanistan at the time, in the late 90s, for example, it means that they feel they have the right to do this. So just using some of those AO1 terms here, totalitarian, theocracy, dystopian, extremism, the Taliban rule by fear. And the more fear that's in a society, the more paranoid its citizens are going to be, because they can't relax. They're always looking behind their shoulder and checking if they're being watched by a Talib, for example. So this is the kind of world that the Taliban has created and is still creating now in Afghanistan, of course. It's pretty much exactly the same as it was before 2001. So the Taliban is significant as a contextual point here. In this novel, as in a number of political and social protest texts, there are contrasts, and one of the contrasts is between childhood and adulthood. So you have, in effect, two separate halves of the book in this Bildungsroman. You have the childhood chapters where Amir is a child, recalling a childhood memory, and then you have when he's grown up and when he's an adult. And if you're thinking of this from a Blakean kind of perspective, that's kind of innocence and experience again. Child versus adult, innocence versus experience. You also have the contrast, of course, of setting. You have the contrast between America and Afghanistan. Polar opposites, I suppose, in terms of what is held up as kind of, I suppose, westernized democracy. So America, the saviour of Baba and Amir, perhaps, as well as countless other refugees over the decades, versus the war-torn dystopia of Afghanistan in the Middle East. I just want to say, going back to that Taliban point as well, one of the things that far-right extremist regimes fail to notice is they actually cause more suffering. So the Taliban is motivated by this naive idea that they're going to create some kind of utopia, some kind of perfect society. What they fail to realise is, in order to get to that utopia, which is often just a pipe dream, in other words, just an aspiration, you've got to create a lot of suffering to get there, particularly if your utopia is not, if you're not inviting particular groups of people. Well, how are you going to get rid of those people then? Ethnic cleansing, Holocaust, genocide, all these kind of things, massacres, what have you. So, yeah, the Taliban is motivated by this naive assumption that you can aspire to something utopian, which is not always the case. Usually what happens is, in order to create a utopia, you're going to have to create a dystopia for somebody else. It's very hard to keep everybody happy all of the time. Hassan is a representation of pure goodliness, unwavering loyalty and sacrifice. And when you have a character like that who is just so perfect or so loyal or so goodly, it just shows up very easily everything else that's imperfect or flawed. And that's one of the things that Amir can't cope with. He can't cope with feeling so inadequate because he's always next to Hassan, who's so perfect. And I suppose there's a degree of jealousy there as well. If you think about the rape scene in chapter 7, one of the flashbacks you have is to the Eid festival where they slaughter a sheep and divvy up the meat towards the poor, the family, and others. And the flashback is that Mamiya says that Hassan had the look of acceptance, the look of a lamb, and clearly the lamb is a motif of sacrifice as well. So, yeah, Hassan is an interesting character in the Kite Runner, and I think, as like I said earlier, probably the character in which the Kite Runner is actually named after. As we said, America versus Afghanistan is quite a significant thing in terms of setting. Hassini, with his father himself, also made exactly the same journey from Afghanistan to America as political refugees. So clearly this is a autobiographical novel in that sense as well. Assaf is an incredibly dark and antagonistic character, but also quite a good character to analyse for an essay. He's the sociopath in the earlier chapters. And it's not surprising that if you have a character like him as a child who rapes Hassan, who is prepared to use his knuckles, who is prepared to use slingshots against others who are innocent and rule with fear and violence, it makes sense that you would be the perfect candidate to be part of the Taliban in later chapters. And that's exactly what happened. So what I always say to students is Assaf as a child foreshadows his participation in the Taliban later. For example, the Ghazi Stadium, and then the fight scene with Amir in the around chapter 21, I think, chapter 22 maybe. We have to think about the choice of narrator that writers have is deliberate. They think very carefully about who they want to be telling the story. And Hassini has chosen an unreliable narrator here. Unreliable because, firstly, he is full of guilt. And also because he's a Pashtun, he doesn't really understand other people's perspectives other than being a Pashtun. So he is unable, for example, to talk about Hassan's perspective of society as a Hazara. So he is biased because he is unable to give a perspective other than his own. And arguably, first-person homodiegetic narrators will always be unreliable because they cannot understand or perceive other people's thinking processes. They can report what a character says or what a character looks like, but they can't often talk about how a character feels what they're thinking. A third-person narrator can, but a first-person narrator can't. So clearly we have an unreliable narrator here in this novel. We also have a Pashtun literate narrator. So Hassini, the writer, has chosen to have a narrator who's also a writer in terms of this idea of storytelling. To also have a literate narrator as well, who's a Pashtun, giving that sense of double standards in society, Pashtun versus Hazara, not very good at giving another perspective, but also to use knowledge and to use words to taunt Hassan, such as giving the wrong definitions of words, such as the word imbecile earlier on in the novel as well. So think of the choice of narrator. Why do we have a Pashtun literate narrator as the storyteller? Because it's not a random decision. It's a conscious choice by the writer. One of the sayings for political and social protest writing is the personal always becomes political. So if you think about it, we, I think, have a sinking feeling in the beginning of the novel. How is Amir and Hassan going to grow up in a society that says they should not be friends because of their different ethnicities or their different groups which they belong to? So you could argue that their friendship is doomed to failure. It becomes their personal friendship becomes a political issue. Also, marriage as well also becomes a political issue as well. For example, the stoning of the Ghazi Stadium, those two people that are accused of adultery. The question is, well, what business does the state have in that kind of personal issue? So you have the large world, the macrocosm, versus the small world, the microcosm. Like we were just saying, the stoning of the Ghazi Stadium, and the way in which the audience or the crowd reacts to that almost suggests that this horrific dystopian spectacle of this stoning with Sharia law has just been normalised, because after a time the crowd just sit in silence and just watch. This is, of course, from the Taliban perspective, a form of mass education. They are wanting to show the public this as a deterrent, and they're saying that God allows them to do this. You know, the cleric stands up with his microphone and says that this is allowed and things. So it shows that corruption of religion again, that theocracy. But it just goes to show, after time, if you live for a long period of time in this kind of situation, you're going to almost become desensitized to it, and it's going to become normalized. And because Amir hasn't lived in Afghanistan, he's obviously flown in from America, he's not as used to it, so he covers his eyes, he looks down, whereas the other people in the crowd, I think, just watch, just completely desensitized to it. The pomegranate tree is another motif. It represents their friendship, Hassan and Amir's friendship. They carve their names into the bark of that tree in the earlier chapters. It's also where they sit to read, or where Amir reads to a Hassan in those early chapters. But over time, the pomegranate tree begins to wilt, and I think by the end it doesn't bear fruit at all. And you could say that metaphorically represents the wilting of their friendship. Quite poignantly, though, when Amir travels back to the pomegranate tree as an adult with Farid the driver, he notices that the initials are still etched into the tree, a bit like a tattoo. So it's, again, quite melancholic, despite Hassan obviously not being around anymore, having died by this point. So that pomegranate tree can also be seen as metaphorical. Another significant point about the pomegranates is, I don't quite remember what chapter it is, but I think it might be chapter 9 or chapter 8, around there. Amir by this point is so racked with guilt that, if you remember, he assaults Hassan by throwing lots of pomegranates at him because he wants Hassan to react and throw pomegranates back. Hassan doesn't, because he's too loyal and doesn't want to hurt his friend. What he ends up doing, though, is he ends up smashing a pomegranate on his own forehead and then walks off. An interesting simile that Amir comes up with is that he says that Hassan looks like he's been shot by a firing squad, which is a kind of eerie foreshadowing of Hassan's execution in chapter 18, I think, or chapter 17, 18, with that letter and what Rahim Khan tells us. So it's this kind of idea of a firing squad. Well, that's actually that's exactly what kills Hassan later in the novel. So that's kind of an interesting link there. Sohrab, Hassan's son and Amir's half-nephew, becomes a device by which Amir can seek redemption. Although it is indirect redemption or forgiveness, because by this point, obviously, Hassan has been killed. So Amir is never going to be able to get forgiveness from Hassan now, but the next best thing is to get forgiveness from his son. And that's why the second half of this novel turns into a bit of a quest narrative, which is to find Sohrab, to bring him to safety. So Sohrab becomes a key to unlock Amir's guilt, and eventually he succeeds and brings, obviously, Sohrab back to America, and he becomes the adopted son of Amir and Soraya in the West. As is often the case in political and social protest texts, children used as vehicles to show the corruption of innocence, and also to see, or to really emphasise, I suppose, the suffering of innocence based on where they are living. So again, this link between the large world and the small world, how innocents in the small world are being impacted on negatively by the wider war and countless regime change in Afghanistan. So children are often important in political and social protest texts. And finally, like we've already said, Hosseini, in writing this novel, one of his intentions was to humanise a region which is often negatively depicted on the news. We are so used to seeing Afghanistan as being, piles of rubble and people living in completely awful conditions because of war. However, there is a great deal of this novel which is about the more romantic side of Afghanistan, the idealistic childhood chapters in the beginning of how Afghanistan used to be, or has the potential to be, a place of traditions and idealism, and also a place of beauty, which is then, of course, contrasted with the dystopian depiction of destruction of the countryside and the surroundings and the setting after many, many years of war and different regime changes. For example, the Russians, and then the Mujahideen, and then the Taliban, and then America, and then the Taliban again. Afghanistan has had this countless list of people that have tried to, I suppose, conquer Afghanistan, and it never is quite successful. Okay, so that is a video all about some significant key points for the Kite Runner. Hopefully that has been useful. And you might find that numerous points on here you could tie into a lot of different essay topics for the social and political protest module. Thank you.